Thank you all for joining us today for this Niskanen Center webinar debate on Time for Choosing, the Center-Right's 3 options for saving American democracy. Glad to have you all here with us. As those of you with long historical memories will remember, Time for Choosing was the title of Ronald Reagan's famous televised speech in support of conservative Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964. Reagan's speech, which launched his political career, called on Americans and particularly Republicans to choose between his brand of conservatism and what he considered to be socialism. But in the wake of the January 6th assaulting of the Capitol and former President Donald Trump's big lie of a stolen election, and the efforts of Republican state legislatures around the country to suppress votes and subvert the electoral process, Americans on the center-right now face a new and hugely consequential decision. Whether they be never-Trumpers or disaffected Republicans or right-leaning independents, they must choose between how and whether to resist the ongoing transformation of the Republican Party into an illiberal party that presents a threat to the continuation of American democracy. And there are really only 3 realistic options for confronting this threat. One of which is to stay in the Republican Party and fight its anti-democratic forces from within. Another is to form an independent center-right third party. Or a third is to join and strengthen a moderate to conservative faction within the Democratic Party. And if you've been following the news lately, you will know that these options have been prominently and publicly debated by a group of around 150 current and former Republican leaders who came together to issue a manifesto, a call for American renewal, which would chart a path forward for the GOP. Some of the leaders of that group are on this call, and they have been in touch, and they wanted me to pass along the information that they are going to be holding a national town hall on June 24th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, where they will debate where their movement is headed. And for more information and to register for that event, you can visit www.acallforamericanrenewal, all one word, .com/townhall. However, today's event is independent of that effort. What we at the Niskanen Center wanted to do today was to bring together 3 articulate and forceful exponents of each course of action open to the pro-democratic center-right. It's labeled as a debate. We're not going to be scoring points, but we do hope to touch upon all of the strengths and weaknesses of these different courses of action. And joining us today, we have Lee Drutman, who's a New America Senior Fellow and author of the great recent book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America. And Lee is going to be making the case for a third-party option. We have Kodiak Hill-Davis, who's Niskanen's Vice President for Political Affairs and co-founder of Republican Women for Progress, who will be advocating the Fight from Within the Republican Party strategy. And Liam Kerr, who's the Massachusetts Director of Democrats for Education Reform and co-founder of the Welcome Party, who will be calling for the center-right to join forces with the center-left in a Democratic Party faction. So welcome to you all. Welcome to our panelists. And to get started, we will be hearing statements from each of our panelists, starting with Lee Drutman, followed by Kodiak Hill-Davis, and then Liam Kerr. Lee, take it away.
All right. Well, it's great to be with you, Jeffrey, and thank you for organizing this incredibly important panel with such a distinguished group. And also thank you for the clever product placement there. As the title of my book suggests, I want to move us past the two-party system. Now, I want to think about the kind of urgency of the moment that we are in right now as a kind of broad framing, which I think we all agree on, perhaps, although maybe that's a point of debate. But what we've seen, particularly since January 6th, but this has been building for a while, is a Republican Party that has really embraced a liberal, anti-pluralist approach to politics. And this is incredibly dangerous and existential to the fate of American democracy, because democracy really depends on a shared set of rules and a shared faith in an electoral process that allows parties to lose elections sometimes. And this is a basic tenet of self-governance, is that we have to agree that we put aside violence, and we have a system in which we resolve our disputes through elections, and those elections are free and fair and impartial. And if we lose the election, we don't make up some fraudulent claim about how it was stolen, and we don't use power to make it harder for our opposing partisans to vote. And the Republican Party is violating those two basic tenets of democracy right now. And it's not clear where this all ends, other than in some sort of democratic breakdown. Now, the history of democracy and democratic decline tells us that what's happening now is the kind of standard pattern of democratic breakdown. And it's partially that there is one party that has embraced liberalism, but it's also a bifurcation of the political system, a high stakes binary in which politics becomes this existential battle of us against them, in which legitimate opposition loses force as a concept, and instead the opposition is the enemy. And under such conditions, partisans say, most important thing is my side winning, and that's the thing that I care most about. And it doesn't really matter if we have free and fair elections or democracy, because the other side poses such a threat. And we've seen this playbook. We see it most recently in Hungary and Turkey and Venezuela. What's happening now is very similar to what's been happening in those countries, in that high stakes, us against them, and my side should break the rules because the other side winning is such a threat. So when we're and also broadly, I mean, democracy depends on a conservative party that believes in democracy. This is something that is really central to the history of democracy. I know a lot of folks have been talking about Daniel Ziblatt's excellent 2017 book about conservative parties, but it makes an incredibly important point that if you don't have a conservative party that believes in democracy, you don't have a democracy. So in thinking about how to confront this crisis, I think we have to understand why it is that the Republican Party has turned into an illiberal party, and what are the forces driving that? Because it's not just Donald Trump. Trump is part of a broader party where everybody has embraced him within the party, more or less, except for a few holdouts. So why did everybody embrace Donald Trump? And I think part of the answer is that once Trump became the head of the party, there was nowhere else for Republicans who dissented to go, other than to join with the Democratic Party, which I know Liam will offer an argument for. But for a lot of Republicans, the Democratic Party is very far away and distant and shares very different values. And what it meant is that a lot of Republicans either got on board with Trump because that's, if they wanted to advance themselves as a Republican, they joined with Trump and his illiberalism, or they just, retired or left, just kind of got out of politics. So in the binary political situation, there was only one place for Republicans to go once Trump became the head of the party. But Trump himself emerged in a particular moment in which American politics has become defined by this urban-rural axis, which is also a cultural divide, which is also an education divide, and creating this incredibly high-stakes battle over the very founding of our nation, what it means to be American, what is our national story. This is really a formative rift that has emerged, and it's very hard to resolve that rift, especially in a binary party system. And again, looking at the decline of democracies, when you have this binary fight over national identity, it becomes very hard to have a resolution as long as partisan conflict remains binary. So, my broader argument in my book is that the key to making American democracy survive is to do what most democracies around the world do, which is to have a proportional multi-party system with many parties, and in the immediate term, what that would mean is a center-right party that would not be the Trump Republican Party, but would be a pro-democracy conservative party that initially would probably have not so much support, but it could form governing coalitions with the left and eventually build up a following, and things would change. It would also allow for some different coalitions, governing coalitions to form. But in the immediate term, it presents a very difficult challenge, because in our two-party system, it's very hard for third parties to win elections, because we have first past the post plurality elections. Now there's been some changes towards more ranked choice voting, which is a little bit more friendly towards third parties, not all that much in the single winner format. There's some introduction of the top four primary in Alaska, may be on the ballot in 2022, but in the immediate term, forming a third party is a kamikaze mission. Now, why is that kamikaze mission worth it in the short term? Well, I think there's a few reasons. One is that parties are really important. Parties are the central institution in American in all democracies, but including in American democracy. And parties form identities, they form organizations, and having that sort of identity and organization they also have advantages in our electoral system. It is, I think, really important to kind of have a lot of folks who are disaffected with the current Republican Party to be able to join together and see that this is a party for me. In the short term, if this the American Renewal Party forms in the 2022 midterms, it could run some candidates. Probably won't win all that many seats, but it could be very pivotal in a handful of swing districts in keeping Trump Republicans from winning. Also, by kind of emphasizing the sort of the spoiler effect of the plurality system, I think it could really help move the ball forward on the case for what I think we need, which is a more proportional voting system in the House with, I have it with ranked choice voting as well as ranked choice voting in the Senate, and could really move us towards a multi-party democracy. Because if we enact electoral reforms that would allow for more parties, we're going to need more parties, and having those parties are already formed and already building identities and groups and lists and engaging people in the hard work of doing politics, I think will be a incredibly important or just incredibly important. So I think, the broader challenge is that as long as we maintain this two-party system, the Republican Party as it's constituted will continue to be competitive in every national election. And as it becomes more and more liberal, the chance of it winning a national election becomes more and more dangerous. And in the two-party system, the Republican Party can win entirely on negative partisanship. It's a constant effort to demonize Democrats as extreme and dangerous, but in a multi-party system, that logic just doesn't work. There's no lesser of three evils. There's only the lesser of two evils. And the far right of the Republican Party will certainly exist as an independent party, maybe the Trump Party, the American, the America Great Again Party, but it can be cleaved off in a way that the AfD in Germany or other far-right European parties are essentially marginalized and kept out of power. So ultimately, I mean, I think we have to recognize the both the short-term stakes, which is that the Republican Party is rapidly descending into a radical, a liberal, anti-pluralist party, but we also need to have a long-term stabilizing, governing vision of what does American democracy look like in 5 years from now, and frankly, what do we want it to look like? Because this is a moment in which the range of possibilities is really wide. It's a moment in which there is, I think, going to be a real tremendous, shift in American politics, and I don't know which way it's going to go, but it depends on having a clear-eyed vision of what kind of future we all want to see.
Thanks, Lee, for making that case for a third party. To make the case for staying within the Republican Party and fighting from within, we now turn to Kodiak Hill-Davis.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't give a quick overview about what Republican Women for Progress is, a bit of our origin story. I think it'll help anchor my remarks. So Republican Women for Progress was founded in the spring of 2017, but it grew out of Republican Women for Hillary, which was founded in the spring of 2016 as our founders grew more and more alarmed at the rapid kind of coalescing around the Trump candidacy in that giant 2016 Republican primary field. And a lot of the concern around the Trump candidacy came from greater concerns about the impact of his rhetoric on our democratic institutions and on the stability of our democracy. So, as you can well imagine, the fall of 2016 was a very difficult time for Republican Women for Hillary, and we decided that we needed to reform, kind of gather our thoughts and figure out what had happened and what could we do in light of the fact that our party took this very sudden turn towards a direction that we didn't necessarily find ourselves in agreement with. And we decided that our approach was going to be to equip and empower more Republican women to run for office, whether it was local, state, or federal, and to champion the return of a big tent Republican Party. As you can imagine, that was incredibly challenging work to be doing in early 2017 and throughout the past 4 years. But we've stayed really committed to that mission, even as we go through different election cycles and we recalibrate and find ways to really champion that core set of principles. The core idea is that by including more Republican women in public discourse and in elected office, we can change some of the negative outcomes we're seeing in the Republican Party. Now, clearly, I would love to sit here and tell you today that I think Republican women are the answer. We are not. It is going to take a multi-pronged approach, and I think both of my co-panelists or co-debaters are going to have really good points, and they've spent a lot of time thinking through their various approaches. But ours at Republican Women for Progress, and the one I still personally am invested in today, is staying and fighting. And there are a few reasons why we're committed to that approach. First, and it's actually a point that Lee made, and I think it's a great one, in some ways, this is our mess to clean up. But there's also a sense of moral imperative. As Lee pointed out, it's been said and history has shown that as a conservative party truly kind of backslides away from democracy and into authoritarianism, there goes the democracy. You can see examples of this in European history. And I believe he cited the scholar whose name I'm forgetting. So I do think there's a moral imperative to staying and fighting and holding the line. And I think what our organization and our work has done over the past 4 years is holding that line and is preventing some of this deterioration. Now, Trump and Trumpism gets most of the media attention. It gets a lot of airtime. It absorbs most of the national dialogue and has for the past several cycles. And while we do have Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia 14, maybe that's in part because Republican Tom Graves retired, and he was pretty reasonable. So I think there are several instances where you see reasonable Republicans growing tired of the fight, understandably so. I completely understand that perspective, and I myself am often tired. But I think holding this line is what slows the deterioration, and staying in the party also retains Republican credibility. Now, I've been called a rhino for most of my life by various people, and yet I still vote Republican and I still show up as a Republican every day. So I think the credibility factor is really important to our work, that we wouldn't have the same credibility with Republican voters or Republican candidates if we were not ourselves still staying and fighting. So I also think it's important to note that while we have freshmen like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene gathering a lot of media attention from their kind of increasingly wild and outspoken antics, we also elected women like Maria Elvira Salazar in Florida 27, who is actively and openly fighting to undo the Trump administration legacy on immigration. Or you have Stephanie Bice, who was elected in Oklahoma 5, who voted for the January 6th commission. So both of these women have stepped out in different ways against the Trumpier wings of the party and held the line. I think there are many other great examples of Republicans, certainly in the House and Senate, who have taken their own way and carved out their own space against this kind of Trumpier, more extreme wing of the Republican Party. So while there's a lot of noise and attention around the more extreme elements of the Republican Party, I think it is important to continually call attention to the Republicans who are standing up and holding the line and doing what I think is right in terms of our democracy, in terms of their role as leaders in our national forum. And I think that those members are also really worth fighting for. When they've taken a stand and they've done the right thing, often at great personal and political costs, I'm sure they've received death threats. I know I have. It's really important that you stay and you support those members. You don't abandon them and you don't encourage them to abandon the Republican Party. So I think at this point, 5 years on, Republican Women for Progress is not scared of continuing to fight. We fight with our own party. We fight with other factions of the Republican resistance, the Never Trumpers. We all have our own ideas about how we're going to solve this collective problem. And as I said, it's not easy. This fight is long and it's exhausting. It's often very discouraging and demoralizing, but I believe it is a fight worth having. And if not us, then who? And so I also think it's important that with all of us today, that this is framed as a debate. And in many ways it is. We will have differences of opinion, but we also agree that there's a big problem and it is an existential threat to our democracy. And we are all in our own way committed to trying to solve it. And I think that that is the important takeaway here, that we have different approaches, but all of our different ideas and all the different work that we're doing in these various lanes is all geared towards trying to strengthen our democracy. And that's, to me, the real key takeaway. And I'm really looking forward to the questions from our attendees and getting more engaged with my co-panelists and having a really thoughtful conversation.
Thank you, Kodiak. Having now heard the case for a center-right third party and for staying and fighting in the Republican Party, we now hear from Liam Kerr on the case for joining a moderate faction within the Democratic Party.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks to Niskanen for hosting us. And as the Democrat, just want to say, up front, I appreciate the patriotism, courage of Never Trumpers, those fighting this fight, my co-panelists, who we do all agree on quite a bunch, and also just respect how strategically complex, how emotional and incredibly important the decisions facing Never Trumpers are for themselves as individuals and for the issues they care about and for the country. And grateful to share our perspective from the Welcome Party, which is, we engage independent voters, we advocate for a big tent Democratic Party. And also grateful to be able to make this case for a path that I think it's specific, it's proven. I think there's a very, very clear investment case. So my recruiting pitch to you, it's don't just resign yourself to becoming a Democrat. Don't meekly, come over to our side of the aisle, subsume your identity in a place you might not feel comfortable. That's not how things work over here. When you become a Democrat, hopefully today, you join affinity groups, subgroups, and you don't come in the Democratic Party as an outcast. You come in as part of a group. I think a group of Never Trumpers, a group of conservatives, a group of current former Republicans or future former Republicans, as Pete Buttigieg would say, and you'll have a voice. And I think even more specifically, just for the next year, the next 18 months, when you join our team, you're not just going to be another Democrat. We need you immediately to deploy to a new front in the battle to save our democracy. And our proposal is that front is congressional districts that are just outside winnability for Democrats today, but with you would be on the table, would expand the map, would fight and win for democracy. So I shared some of this perspective in a Bulwark piece a couple months ago and compared the options to unicorns and a platypus. So, this is the platypus option. It might seem small. It's definitely a little awkward. When you describe it, it might be kind of hard to picture exactly what we're talking about. But the platypus option, I think, meets three of the questions that should guide this question for the center right. So how urgent, as Lee mentioned, how urgent is this? What do we do with, let's call it 7% of the electorate? And then where do we want to be 1 year from now? So, taking that question first of how urgent, we're in a funky time right now. So, it seems like Trump's been here forever. Tomorrow marks 6 years since he came down the escalator announcing his campaign. On the other hand, we're 7 months after the election. It's 5 months since January 6th. COVID slowing, politics at least a little bit receding from some parts of our culture. And a lot of people are, just exhaling right now. But this is a scary moment. In the last 6 years, we have not seen a Democratic Party that consistently was able to reach out and bring you all over. And a never Trump movement that hasn't been able to really put points on the board or change incentives for GOP incumbents. The incentives right now all point in one direction for GOP incumbents, Trump. And so the time to get ready for 2022 is now, and we need a sense of urgency. The second question, what do you do with 7% of the electorate? I think we do need some data point, some number to ground us for this conversation today. What share of the electorate is both right of center, but is also willing to prioritize the rule of law, willing to fight, stand up for democracy. And based off of polling, appears about maybe 7% of the overall electorate. So in the mindset of this debate of these decisions facing us on the center left and center right, what do you do with those 7% of voters? And then a third guiding question, timing. Where do we want to be a year from now? Specifically, tangibly, what are we going to do and where will we be 1 year from now? Midterms are in 17 months. And so I think it makes sense to think about, the primaries will be about this time next year. And that makes now a time for action. So what will things look like in June 2022? So the idea, this proposal I'm sharing, it has these three things. It's specific, it's proven, and it's got a clear investment case. It has a limited downside, positive externalities, and really significant upside. I want you to picture Jared Golden. So Democratic congressman, Maine 2nd District, used to work for Susan Collins. You can actually picture him. He's got the big Celtic cross tattoo right here, buzz cut. He won re-election by 6 points in a district Trump won by 8. Okay. So with that image, fast forward to a year from now. Now I want you to picture a dozen candidates like him. They don't have to look like him, but people who are distinct from the National Democratic Party. People who maybe represent the values of the center right in some ways and appeal broadly. And imagine them running in congressional districts all around the country that currently are not competitive in a general election, but would be with these 7% of voters and with you. Picture you helping them. So why should you spend your time on this? Again, specific, proven, and clear investment case. So specific, it's tangible. We can look at the specific districts, right? Places that Trump got 50, 51, 53, 55, 57% of the vote, right? Places where Democrats aren't competing well. This is something very specific we can all collectively start doing now. It's proven. The organizational model is proven. The distinct candidate model is proven. And the impact is proven. People just haven't put it together on the center. So thinking about the model, obviously the DCCC, the NRCC, they have models. They staff up to recruit candidates, run analyses, staff candidates, support candidates, determine where to allocate financial resources through a network. But more importantly than the DCCC or NRCC model, Justice Democrats on the far left has shown that outside groups that are not affiliated with parties are able to do the same thing on a smaller scale. And they really fulfill, the Salden, Steve Tellis framework, the Niskanen Center Futures Faction framework. Distinct networks, distinct organizations, and a distinct support system within a party structure. We can build that model here. Candidates, the candidate model is proven, distinct from the National Democratic Party brand. 3 Democrats won districts that Trump won, where Trump got a majority, excuse me. They didn't win these by a hair. They flipped these by 7, 8, 14 points. When you have that distinct candidate with the set bio, you're able to carve out a niche. And by collectively doing this, there'd be an even bigger niche. And the impact, this is a proven impact. So Justice Democrats, they don't just show an operational model. They've shown what happens when you take a bunch of incumbents in safe seats, like the dozens and dozens of Republicans that have taken anti-democratic actions that are safe right now in general elections, and you give a credible threat to those candidates. What has Justice Democrats shown when you take people who previously didn't have to worry about a primary, didn't have to worry about a general, who now have to worry about one of those things? Brookings and R Street did a bipartisan study, Elaine Kmark and a counterpart of hers. And it showed that candidates they irrationally respond when they go from being unthreatened to threatened, right? They change more than they should. Now, the paper's called Anticipating Trouble, Congressional Primaries and Incumbent Behavior. Right now, the only trouble that you have to anticipate if you are a Republican in one of these districts is a primary, is Trump. That's all you have to worry about. We can change those incentives and make them pay a price. Taking an investment approach, investment kind of mindset, we're addressing a market failure by doing this. We're doing something that has very limited downside, very positive externalities, and has a massive upside. So on the market failure point, spending on new elections is growing rapidly. It's doubling, every couple of years, every couple of cycles. But there's fewer truly contested seats. So we've got a lot more money focused in a lot fewer places. Right? That creates a hurdle rate that should be going up and up and up into the millions to putting a new seat on the table. Every new seat, every one that is worth 10% has a 10% chance of flipping. Right? What is that worth? Right? If Congress is only decided by a few seats, what is one new seat on the map with a 10 or 25% chance of flipping? What is that worth? There's some new donor advisors that kind of brought this mindset to the 2018, 2020 elections, thinking with this investment mindset. This is a model of philanthropy that's proven and needs to be untapped for this model. So we have this, market failure. We've got this potentially massive upside, huge ROI. We also have limited downside and positive externalities. So even if these candidates lose, these individual candidates, they'll change incumbent behavior. People will pay a price. Even having to run the election will pay a price. It will send a signal. Even one big victory will be the AOC of this center. And it'll help the Democratic Party brand. It'll achieve a healthier democracy by putting more competitive seats out there. So, there's some kind of high-level hesitations. I'll just address 2 of them quickly. First is, I think the idea that if you're a Republican kind of emotionally, the leftists have taken over your potential future party. I would say, don't get high on your own supply on that. I think that is the narrative out there. Obviously, it's the narrative coming from the right, but it's just not true. And I think you'll find that once you're here. Just look up in New York, look at the mayoral election, right? The leftists are having trouble getting somebody in the top 3 in New York City, right? They got a couple members of Congress, they got a ton of people on Twitter, but you're not going to let that stop you from saving democracy. Or I hope you're not going to let that stop you from saving democracy. And the second thing is labels, this sense of I am this and I'm here and need to stay, where I am. There's an opportunity to build your own label, build your own identity brand. Reagan Democrats, Democratic Republicans, conservative Democrats, we can find the label, we can find the phrase, we can find something people will be attracted by. And so I think together, moderate Democrats, former Republicans who are committed to the rule of law, we can come together, compete in new districts, build a truly big tent Democratic Party, demonstrate that to the country, build a faction of conservatives and moderates and rule of law Republicans within the Democratic Party, change the incentives for incumbents, create a new, healthier political landscape by this time next year. Change the whole conversation. In closing, I think a bunch of people are on here among the, shared a concept paper on this with about 15 people. And about a dozen of them come back, pretty quickly and say, this seems like the most important thing we can be doing right now. I just want to add one big bonus. It'd be fun as hell. I think we just have a great time. I think people hop in the chat, pick a place, pick a time, a couple dozen moderate Democrats, bunch of never Trump Republicans get together, go watch the Knocking Down the House documentary on Justice Democrats. Now, let's do it. Save democracy, make friends, have some fun. And I'm excited for the conversation.
Thanks, Liam. Your talk of ROI and externalities show that you clearly have been talking to Republicans lately. I think all of you panelists did a fantastic job of laying out a positive case for your options for the center-right, but of course we all know that media thrives on conflict, not on positive agreement. So I wonder if you could all go through and point out the negatives of your opponent's positions, the drawbacks, if you will. Some of that has been implicit in what you've been saying, but I want to hear it explicit. So Lee, can we start with you and talk about why your position for a center-right third party is superior to either staying in the Republican Party or joining the Democrats?
Absolutely, I'd be glad to. So I think Kodiak and Liam both presented very compelling cases. So I want to start with Kodiak's case because I actually find myself a little bit more sympathetic to Kodiak's case than Liam's case. Precisely because of the importance of. Actually, let me start with Liam's. I'll start by criticizing Liam's argument and then move to Kodiak's argument because I'm more sympathetic to Kodiak's position. Precisely because I think of the importance of a conservative party that's committed to a democracy is incredibly important. Now, Liam is talking about where do we want to be 1 year from now, and is talking about winning elections. I don't see a vision for where we are 5 years from now. And I think one of the, I'll lay my cards on the table. I'm a Democrat. I've been a Democrat my entire life. I want Democrats to win more elections, and certainly don't want Republicans to take back the House or the Senate. But I also fear what will happen to the Republican Party if it loses the few moderate members that it has remaining, and becomes even more of a minority party. Now, I know that's not Liam's arguing that we should have make more elections competitive by running some more Jared Golden types in R+5, 6 districts, which sure, I'm not opposed to that, but I think there's a trade-off there. How resources get invested, and a lot of money can go into these campaigns and just kind of wind up wasted, because most voters are not voting for the candidate, they are voting for the party. And Jared Golden, there's 3 Democrats that won in Trump districts, and that's 3 out of 435. It's well, I guess there's probably about 230 Trump districts, maybe 220. 220 probably, and then there's going to be a challenge. But the broader point is that we've got to focus on the long term here and not the short term. And the long term challenge is that Democrats, even if Democrats win, Republican Party is still going to be a fundamentally a liberal party, and it will still be based in this kind of grievance politics, and we'll still have a zero-sum 2-party system. And that is the fundamental challenge here, which is that we need to break out of this zero-sum binary because of what it does to how we engage in politics, this winner-take-all logic in which it's all about demonizing the other side, and it's creating these incredibly high-stakes elections that are driven by negative partisanship. And also the fact that we, more broadly, I mean, the problem is we have a lot of lopsided districts everywhere. And that's a function of our urban-rural partisan split on top of a winner-take-all system. If you have a more proportional voting system in the House, multi-member districts with some sort of proportional voting rule, it could be ranked choice, it could be something else. What you have is districts that are competitive everywhere, and you have a center-right party that can compete in a lot of places, as well as a center-left party that can compete in a lot of places. And that brings in a lot more people. It means that every district is going to be competitive everywhere, and there'll be a range of candidates running. So we're not just going to focus on these handful of districts. Suddenly the whole world opens up. And frankly, if you're a political consultant, that's great for you, because now you have a lot more work as opposed to just going on these handful of districts. But I think the core point is that just helping Democrats win the next election is not enough. I mean, I certainly support it, but I think we've got to think more broadly again about what is the party system that we want to build 5 years from now, not how are we going to win the next election, because this constant focus on winning the next election, it is the thing that is precisely driving us into this doom loop, because it's always about how can we demonize the other party and crush them, and then what do you win? You've just won power, and then it's the next election. So I think Kodiak has an incredibly important point, and this idea that we need to have a conservative party that believes in democracy. But I want to quote something you said, Kodiak, which is you said it slows the deterioration. But slowing the deterioration is not reversing the deterioration. It's just slowing what seems like the inevitable. And talk about folks retiring, and Graves retired, being replaced by Marjorie Taylor Greene. And this is, if you look at who's running, who's emerging as candidates in 2022 and who's stepping down, the deterioration seems to be continuing. And so, I certainly support reversing it, but it seems like, it seems like you're fighting a losing battle here. And that battle has been going in the wrong direction for several years now. And so I'm just not sure what's going to change. At a certain point, you have to, some costs or whatever, just have to kind of cut your losses and try something different. I'm reminded of the Einstein definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I don't know. It seems like things have gotten worse. I would have thought that after January 6th, there would have been this moment when, it was like this kind of brief moment when Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy were trying to push Trump aside, and they just failed for whatever reason. The Republican Party, the caucus within Congress is more angry at Liz Cheney than they are at Marjorie Taylor Greene. So I don't know what your theory is about what's going to change if you keep, maybe you can keep get a few more Adam Kinzingers in the caucus, but look at what's going on in the states. Look at what's going on with the January 6th commission. Maybe I'm missing something here, but you tell me what's going to change.
Thanks, Lee. Kodiak, can you respond both to Lee's criticism and to Liam's implicit criticism of your position about staying and fighting in the Republican Party?
Sure, I love a multi-front war, just like Napoleon. And I'm about the same height he was. So let me first respond, I think, to Lee's excellent point. And I love being quoted back to myself. Slowing the deterioration, exactly right. It's a clear indication that there's a much larger problem. And one of the things that we've really tried to do as an organization, and I sort of alluded to this, is that this is a dynamic situation, and it has both short-term strategic implications and longer-term strategic implications. And there's certain ways that we've tried to structure our work to prevent certain outcomes in the near term while preserving the opportunity to build towards a better outcome in the long term. And some of that goes to holding the line. So in the 2018 cycle, Republican Women for Progress as a super PAC, we weighed in on 11 races where we supported moderate Democratic female candidates. We encouraged and recruited Republican women in those districts to speak out about why they were lifelong Republicans, but they were not going to pull the lever for Republican in that race. And we were successful in 9 of those races. And those are moderate members of the Democratic House Conference. And I'm still really proud that we supported them in that cycle, because in 2018, it seemed to us that the most important way to preserve opportunities for a reformed Republican Party was to shift some of the balance of power out of the hands of the Republican Party back into the hands of the Democrats. So in 2020, different playing field, different strategy. We supported almost 20 Republican women who were running for both the House and the Senate. We saw incredible historic returns in that cycle. We also saw the loss of Donald Trump as president, which we were encouraged by, but certainly we understand that that's not the end of this fight. But a lot of those Republican women who we supported, I referenced in my opening remarks, they have turned around and done exactly the sort of things and made the hard decisions, even going against their party leadership at times, that we wanted to see out of Republican leaders. So we will continue to support them as they hold those lines. But I think the other thing involved in this is a constant recalibration. I certainly don't own the answers to all of these questions. And I'm constantly asking myself, what have I missed? What can I do differently? And I encourage other people in this space to continue doing the same thing, because it's really easy to think, sitting in my living room late at night, that I've got the answer and I know the solution. But if I'm not constantly recalibrating and checking what my premise is against what I'm seeing play out, there's no way I'm going to be effective. We also can't do all things. So our mission and our organization really tries to stay in this lane of supporting moderate Republican women, reminding the media that we exist, that we're not all Marjorie Taylor Greens, which I think is important, but also really championing this idea of a big tent and retaining space for sensible moderate Republicans within the party, even if it means fighting with our own party, which is, as I mentioned, exhausting and not that fun. So that's how I would answer Lee's concern. And I think it's a really good one. The concern I have with Lee's approach is that the multi-party or the third party approach doesn't dismantle the RNC and the Republican Party structure. And as we've all kind of indicated, I think we're all in agreement on this, that in its current iteration is really dangerous. It is not backing candidates across the board who are committed to our democratic institutions, to things like the rule of law, the separation of powers, the importance of free and fair elections. And so my concern is that without dismantling some of that party apparatus, which is super important, not just culturally, but structurally, you kind of leave the inmates running the asylum. I made a joke recently to my boss, Jerry Taylor, that I'm concerned that if I leave the Republican Party, I'm leaving Arkham Island to the inmates, and it just gets bigger and scarier, and no one's there to at least try to police it. But the other concern I have with the multi-party or third-party approach, and it's something that was articulated by a scholar who is also, I believe, associated with Niskanen, Frances Lee. She writes a big paper, I think it came out last year, on populism. And one of the biggest threats of populism and this kind of backsliding into authoritarianism that she lays out is that and we see in Europe, and I think Lee and I have both hit on this point, in some ways, our American democracy has been insulated from that real threat because we have a strong two-party system, and our elections are national on some level, but also administered by the states. There are all these different ways in which you have populism kind of crop up in each party, but it isn't a controlling faction in either party. But that if you open it up to a multi-party system, some of that firewall may erode. So that's a longer term concern I have with both of those points. But I agree that I thought that January 6th would have been a much clearer turning point and a real opportunity to break from some of the anti-democratic elements in the Republican Party. And so to Liam's points, and I guess my concerns with Liam's approach are more short-term. My concerns with Lee's approach are more long-term. But siphoning off moderates from the Republican Party doesn't fix the Republican Party. And so you're left again with this Arkham Island kind of asylum where you have all these lunatics on the right who, by the very nature of having, if you're in a two-party system, which we currently are, if you have one party going completely off the rails and to the extremes, you don't have that tension in the center that pulls the other party back. And I know what you're talking about with the Welcome Party is building that center so that that tension can bring both parties together. But I worry that by siphoning off the moderates from one party, you're just moving them, and they're not necessarily going to create that holistic center tension that keeps kind of the both parties in line. Right. So if the Republican Party continues to spiral and go further to the right and further to the extreme, I don't know how we bring, the Democratic Party back in line, because I would argue that there's some extremism happening over there too that's deeply concerning. Not to the same degree, but also concerning.
Thanks, Kodiak. Liam, how do you respond to the claims made by both those who, like Lee, advocate a center-right third party and those like Kodiak who are trying to reform the Republican Party from within?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think one, interesting thing just to go back to, I think at one level, it seems like there's a lot that we all agree on. But at the same time, as I'm listening, I don't actually feel that much urgency. So it doesn't seem like, well, we're more worried about the 5-year than the 1 year. There's kind of a vague sense that, if there's hypothetically more tension between the party, we are talking about something I think very real, concrete, urgent. There's an election in 17 months. And so I think specificity is just really important. Like I think the second thing, in addition to, I think, getting a little confused on how much urgency there is, how much is our democracy at risk? How much do we need to ensure that people who believe in the rule of law control Congress in 17 months? I also don't know specifically what you're recommending center-right people do. Like, what would people do next week, next month, and 6 months? And so I think that's another kind of aspect. So the urgency piece, like, are we all on the same page about how dire the situation is facing our democracy right now and for 2022? To specifically, what should people do? What races specifically are we talking about? And then the third thing I think is thinking about those downside risks more specifically. So I know Lee mentioned, you could have a third party that runs some candidates in swing districts. I mean, that is so scary to me. Splitting the anti-Trump vote in swing congressional districts next year. I mean, if you have a bunch of political consultants that raise some money for, and promise they're going to go run these independent candidates. I mean, yes, if we had ranked choice, but if all this other stuff was done first, then I get it. That makes sense. But I don't think risking our democracy, so hopefully at some point we can get to a 3-party system, is a good bet. Because specifically in the districts they would run that was mentioned, those are swing districts. And so splitting the anti-Trump vote in a swing district and handing the gavel to Kevin McCarthy, that doesn't sound so good. One other quick downside point. I think there is a lot. It's still 6 years on of like, I wish more people changed after X, right? And so the insurrection's the latest one, right? Like, we're surprised more people didn't. I mean, we're, as of Thursday, we'll be in year 7 of the Trump GOP. And we have to stop being surprised. And I think when you look at some of the specific candidates, so Maria Salazar from Florida, for example, was mentioned. If she's the one person we're holding up in this discussion for one end of the debate, I mean, she is a D on the Republican Accountability Project scorecard, right? She has not said that the election, if that's who we're holding up, I don't know what the point is in some part. And then lastly, again, back to kind of specifics and thinking about, Cheney and others, the polling that we've seen, in Wyoming, 14% of Republican primary voters in an April Club for Growth poll said they vote for Cheney, definitely, right? 52% said they vote against no matter what. Anthony Gonzalez voted for impeachment in Ohio, right? He's down 10 points. When people are told he voted for impeachment, he's down 52 points in the primary, right? And this is just math. What do you do with 7% of people? You don't win swing districts with 7% of people, and you don't win primaries with 7% of people, but you can make a difference in a bunch of districts with 7%. North Carolina Senate poll out yesterday, independent poll. McCrory, former governor, he's up 26. And then people are informed that Trump endorsed his opponent. He's down 20. There's just nowhere to go there. So I don't want to be, intensely negative, just realistic. And one last point, I think the future that both Lee and Kodiak envision, I actually think the best path to get there is through building a faction. I think Lee made a really strong point that this faction could be an important step on the path towards a more representative, healthier democracy. I totally agree. I just think actually being able to win elections, build an ecosystem, demonstrate that you have that faction actually makes an even stronger case for that than a breakaway third party would.
Thanks, Liam. Before we move to audience questions, would any of you like to offer one quick and pointed rejoinder to any of the points raised by your other debaters? Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, so I want to respond in particular to Kodiak's point, referencing Francis Lee's excellent paper on populism and the kind of extent to which the American political system has long been insulated against populism. Now, this is a really important point in terms of thinking about the value of a multi-party system versus a two-party system when it comes to what you deal with extremism. How you deal with extremism. Now, the longstanding criticism of multi-party politics has been that if you are 15% of the voters, you get 15% of the seats. And so what you've seen in Europe, there are various waves and then recessions of right-wing populism, is that right-wing populism, right-wing populist parties, and to some extent left-wing, although they tend to be more authoritarian populist, right-wing, can get 10 to 15% support, and then that reifies the party, and it has an institution, and it has a brand, and it has a mechanism for running candidates. And that's the reality of party politics in a multi-party system, is you're going to have those extremist parties. Now, question, and whereas in the US party system, for a long time, we had sort of diffuse populism, but because of the kind of diffuse nature of the American party system, the overlapping party coalitions, you have liberal Republicans that Jeffrey has written extensively about, alongside conservative Republicans, that that the extreme anti-system folks were kind of marginalized. There were certainly John Birchers going back a long time, and that you can draw a through line from the John Birch Society through the Tea Party. But until the Tea Party, there was still a liberal to moderate faction within the Republican Party that could do battle against the kind of extremist liberals. But as the party system realigned and nationalized, all of those sort of meso institutions that, and factions within the party that would have done battle have lost out. And so the danger in a two-party system is that once you have an extremist faction that takes over one of the two major parties, that's kind of game over. Because it's once you've lost that battle, particularly in this nationalized politics, it's very hard to get it back. As Liam has pointed out here, and as you, I think, Kodiak, acknowledge. And part of that has to do with the way in which the U.S. party system is operating now, as opposed to how it's operated in the past. And it's much more nationalized now than it has ever been. And that's been a real sea change over the last 3 decades. And we have to work within the nationalized party system that, just because everything is nationalized, and we can't, and there was liberal Republicans used to win elections throughout New England and in some cities and on the coast. But because people are voting for the party now, Charlie Baker can be governor of Massachusetts, but there's no way he would ever win a Senate seat in Massachusetts as a Republican. Larry Hogan can be governor of Maryland, but there's no way he'd ever win a Senate seat statewide in Maryland, because people want the Democrats to control Congress. So because it's a 2-party system. So now the case for allowing the extremist party to have its share is that it's easier to see how big that party is, and then for governing coalitions to form that marginalize that party. So you look at Germany, you look at Sweden, you look at European democracies where there is a far right party. What happens? The center right and the center left get together and form a centrist governing coalition that marginalizes the far right party. And the other thing that's important is that there's kind of this ebb and flow of far right parties, throughout Europe over the last 70 years. And the party rises, and then it starts to fall, and then there's all kinds of internecine fighting, and the far right fractures because they don't have that close access to power that can unite them. The Republican Party is so close to power or in power that unites them, whereas the far right parties, they start fighting against each other because they don't actually have access to power. So look, far extremism is a danger wherever. But it's a lot easier for fluid coalitions to come together in a multi-party system, and for parties to emerge and to die, and for there to be different party identities that engage people in a multi-party system. It's just in the U.S. where unless there's some way for a center-right party to emerge that believes in the rule of law and democracy, I think American democracy is, screwed. And the only way for a center-right party to emerge is as a third party. Ideally, we will get to proportional representation, but you need the emergence of that third party to help push things forward.
Thanks, Lee. Kodiak or Liam, do you have like a 1-minute rejoinder?
There's a lot to say there.
I do. I'll make it brief. I think that's an excellent point, Lee. My concern is that the kind of centrist Republicans would be the 15%, and instead of being housed and contained as extremists, they would be housed and contained, and the extremists would actually be in retained power in this structure. I don't know that would happen, but I'm concerned that it would. But I think you raise a lot of excellent points. And Liam, I think the work that you're doing is great. I think one of the things that you're doing that's so important is that you're giving individuals who have a tribal connection to their party, you're giving them a way to leave that identity and go to another space. And that's super important. You can't just look at a Republican and say, you should be ashamed at the party and you should not be a Republican, because you're not telling them where else to go. And my final thought is, what can we do right now? You write checks and you join PACs supporting candidates that are taking the hard choices and making the hard votes. So you support those candidates. That's how you really, whether they're Republican or Democrat, if you see a candidate as an everyday citizen who's doing the right thing consistently and you like that candidate, support that candidate. It's critically important. You can't just sit at home watching MSNBC or Fox and getting angry. You've got to actually support the candidates.
Thanks, Kodiak. Liam, quick rejoinder to anything raised, if you'd like.
Yeah, just so very, very briefly, I would say there's 2 themes that are really troublesome, I think, in our politics just in general, that I think the faction argument within the party exploits in a way. One is a lot of the Republican advantage in Congress is from efficiency across districts. And that efficiency comes from a ton of districts that are 55% Republican. And so this is a way, there is this opportunity here that we can take advantage of. Second, I think, is this narrative that the socialist left has taken over, which is just not true. And this is a way to, they've gone so far that it's easy to block them off and have them as a useful foil to actually win some of these races.
Thanks, Liam. We seem to have lost Lee, but we're hoping he'll be joining us again soon. Let me take a few questions then from the audience. And the first one goes to Kodiak. And it's really just a question about how many moderates do you think there actually are in the Republican ranks in both the House and the Senate right now?
That's a great question. And I think it really depends on how you define moderate. And this is something that Jeff and I, as colleagues, have spent a long time kind of debating back and forth. But Republican Women for Progress would say that we don't have a litmus test. We don't like purity tests. I consider you a moderate if you're evaluating kind of the information in front of you and you're trying to make the best decision possible for your district or community, and you're not doing kind of extreme things like saying the election was stolen or comparing the Democratic Party to Nazi Germany. So I think my view of moderates is pretty expansive, and it's a much smaller coalition than it had been in years past, and that's what we're trying to do is to rebuild that. But I think when you look at different vote counts, and there are always reasons behind the ways that members are voting and how they're positioning themselves. So just looking at something as simple as the January 6th commission vote and saying, well, if you didn't vote yay for the creation of this bipartisan coalition commission, then you're definitely not moderate. I don't think that's right. I don't think that takes into consideration all the nuance that different members are having to interact with. So I think the faction's bigger than it appears. But a lot of the moderates are really committed to the business of governing, and that's not glamorous, and it's not landing you on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It's not landing you on Fox News, and it's not landing you on MSNBC.
Thanks, Kodiak. Liam, the question comes up for you. What kind of policy victories can never-Trumpers and center-right people more generally expect if they throw their support to a moderate faction of the Democratic Party?
Yes, I'd say the continuation of the world's oldest democracy would be one, and I think one that we should focus on. I also think, we do in a way have a three-party system right now. Our country is not half conservative and half liberal. Our country has 40%, mostly white, mostly Christian, largely conservative in a block, and then two other fairly significant factions of moderate and liberal voters. About a quarter of voters identify as liberal. It is already a minority within the Democratic Party. Democrats getting 53% of the vote nationally, 25% of those are liberal. And a slightly larger figure are moderate and conservative. And so there are already really robust debates within the party. I'm sure everybody's seen those debates within the Democratic Party. And so, effectively what we're talking about is adding to that intra-party debate. And I think Kodiak had the note about litmus tests. I think what we would maybe propose is the litmus tests are you're for the rule of law, peaceful transition of power and democracy. And the third litmus test is there's no other litmus tests, no other purity tests, and that there are robust debates on a number of issues within the party. And I think you'd see, I don't want to say a return, but you definitely, I think, see a trend back towards more, productive conversation and more, patchwork passing of a wide range of policies.
Thanks, Liam. Lee, welcome back. Totally understandable if your internet would be patchy, given that the divine being was trying to eradicate DC through thunderstorms last night.
Yes.
Let me ask you a quick question from the audience. How realistic is a third party option given all of the obstacles that our system puts in place of a third party? And what would have to be done to make it more viable?
Well, in the short term, there are tremendous obstacles given the plurality first past the post system that a third party can only hope to run as a spoiler. And I want to use this opportunity to engage with Liam's point from before about whether it's dangerous to split the anti-Trump vote or to put it in the Democratic column. And I think there's a lot of folks. My sense is who might support a conservative candidate running as a third party, who just don't want to vote for a Democrat because the idea of voting for a Democrat just seems anathema. More importantly, I think the spoiler effect of that. If there are elections in which a third party candidate runs, the effective third party candidacies in the history of American politics has been to elevate issues in a way that major parties can't. And by elevating the issue of democracy itself in a way that is, essentially orthogonal from the left-right fight, it creates a different dynamic in the conversation. It's clear who the Republicans who are voting for the anti-Trump conservative party are. And, I don't think it's a huge number. It may be 7%, it may be 15%. It's not enough to win within the Republican Party, but it's enough to make a statement and to reorient the national conversation in important ways and move towards what is really necessary for third parties to compete, which would be to in the House particularly to pass the Fair Representation Act, which was just introduced on Friday by Congressman Don Beyer, which would create multi-member districts, so proportional representation, essentially, with ranked choice voting. And that would allow center-right parties and center-left parties to compete independently of further right and further left parties. And I think that would be an incredibly essential, productive development in American politics, because there is there's a short-term and a long-term issue here. And I recognize the urgency of the short term, but I think we also have to talk about the long term. And one of the advantages of running third-party candidates as opposed to running candidates within the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is that it really opens up the long-term conversation. And I think I think Democrats can keep the House with with spoiler American renewal candidates just as likely as they are to keep the House by running Jared Golden's under the Democratic label in Republican +7 districts. I think Liam and I could debate different theories about how voters respond, but I think they're both equally likely to succeed in the short term. I think the third party option is much more likely to build a different long-term future and get American politics out of the stuck binary, which is, we know from, again, this is a really important point to emphasize. We know from democratic declines around the world that when politics becomes polarized, deeply polarized in an us versus them way around formative rifts around national identity, in which both sides start calling each other the enemy, dangerous to the republic, democracy doesn't survive for long. And that's the core thing that we have to fix. So in the short term, yes, the Democrats need to win the 2022 midterms, but in the long term, we need to get out of this destructive cycle, because there's a difference between slowing the deterioration and building back something new that is better. And at a certain point, you've got to invest for the long term as well as the short term. You can't just worry about. Sometimes you just need to do a fundamental transformation, and that's hard. But you can't just keep putting that off and hope things will work out if you don't plan for the future beyond the next election.
Thanks, Lee. Kodiak, Catherine Schroeder from the audience directed a question to you specifically, which is, how can those who want to stay and fight within the Republican Party avoid the fate of Liz Cheney, or indeed avoid the fate of coming within the trigger sites of Donald Trump and his followers?
Well, that's a really great question. I wonder, though, I may not be in agreement on the premise. I think Liz Cheney stood by her principles and did the right thing, and we're not guaranteed to maintain that seat in any given cycle, even if it's an R+25. I think what we need our leaders to do is stop chasing the base and start sticking by their principles. And I think Liz Cheney did a great job of that. And let's be honest, Cheney's ground game in Wyoming is quite strong. She's going to have to campaign harder than she would have had she not stood by her principles and stood up to Donald Trump. But I'm not in agreement, and I'm not sure, and I think RWFP is here as well. You know, I'm not convinced about the durability of the Trump base. I think there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of smoke, and there may be some fire, but I think this 2022 midterm cycle is going to be really, really illuminating about how that base actually works. And Liam referenced the fact that former Governor McCrory is up until Trump endorsed his opponent, and now his polling isn't looking as good, but we're still a ways away from that election. So I would actually say that I don't think Liz Cheney really lost anything. She lost her conference chair, but she stood by her principles. She still has her House seat. And in some ways, it's liberated her to do exactly what she thinks she needs to do for her state.
Thanks, Kodiak. Liam, let me slightly rephrase a question that came up from the audience. One of the things that those Never Trumpers who already have started talking to Democrats and seeing themselves as part of that team have realized is that Democrats seem to be really bad at politics. They invest all kinds of efforts in legislation that will not pass and has no chance of passing. They don't take victories where they could be gotten. They're not seemingly interested in separating themselves from really unpopular positions like defund the police or socialism. They lose elections that they ought to win. What kind of hope can you offer then for the Never Trumpers that coming over they will be both welcomed and not rejected by tribal Democrats, and also that they will have a real impact on the party, not just in its policy positions, but also in how it conducts the very effort of politics?
Yeah, so I think, try to be clear at the outset. This is not, just sign your I'm a Democrat card and then sit in the pew. This is bring some of your gifts and unique talents and unique messaging abilities. And a lot of that is winning. I think the welcoming aspect of that, I'd be interested, like Kodiak, how many people have tried to recruit you, aggressively tried to get you and your compatriots to flip? How willing are we to do this? And I think Lee brings up this really invokes a really powerful, the negative partisanship is sickening our country. And what we are proposing is intense pro-partisanship, intense recruitment. It is and I think the factional construct laid out by us gives a real kind of ideological or conceptual framework with which to say, look, the Bulwark has tens of thousands of paying monthly subscribers, right? It's already, in terms of people who are putting their money where their mouth is, as big or bigger than Justice Democrats. You've got groups on the center right that are already organizing, bringing people together, a way of talking. And so if they say, we are going to defend democracy and we are going to come together within the Democratic Party in a faction, they can also bring some of those political gifts, right? The ability to look and say, we know how to win. And I think that's a hugely attractive thing about bringing more, operatives and more of that mentality into the fold and in thinking about the stakes. I think I'll give a specific example to that. The day that the vote on Liz Cheney occurred, one of Doug Lamborn's aides sued him. And so Doug Lamborn, congressman from the 5th District in Colorado, his aide sued him, alleging, he gave him COVID, wouldn't let them wear masks. His son is living in his Capitol office. And you look at this, and he was not challenged by a Democrat. The Democratic nominee against spent $120,000. I mean, he was not challenged. Trump got less than 55% in his district. And I think a bunch of you that come over, I don't know where we're going to go. If you guys want to go to Charleston or Virginia Beach or Charlottesville or whatever, we'll go somewhere this summer. We'll get 100 of us together and we'll pick out these districts, and how to win. And you'll say, you know what, Lamborn actually, turns out he paid his wife $100,000 to do his campaign accounting. That seems sketchy. Seems like there's a lot of sketchy stuff. A Washington Post reporter recently put out a thing about how little opposition research is done on these candidates in safe seats. Who's great at opposition research? Republicans. And so I do think that there is a lot that you can bring with that killer instinct. And we can go do it. And on the welcoming front, I mean, look, I mean, we're trying to be part of that. And I think it's a snowball. Once the pieces are all there, once it starts happening, it will accelerate and you will feel at home here. They're not going to attack you any more than they attack Manchin, trust me.
Lee, you famously back in, I guess it was after the 2016 election, did some work with the voter study group to do an analysis of public opinion. And you did a kind of 4-quadrant scatter plot of economic views versus social views. And the empty quarter in that diagram, the Rub al-Khali of American politics, was economically conservative and socially liberal. So what sense does it make to actually try to form a third party that would represent that empty quarter of American politics? Would it not make more sense to run another kind of populist third party person like a Ross Perot, who got almost 20% of the vote?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's, I mean, that is the challenge that the Liz Cheney wing of the Republican Party, which is more of the Acela wing of, you know, socially liberal, but economically, fiscally conservative, is, you know, it doesn't have a huge base of support. I mean, I think there would be a tremendous support for a kind of Ross Douthat type candidate who's more socially conservative but economically liberal, but also committed, you know, to some extent to democracy. And you know, frankly, I don't know why anybody hasn't figured out how to do that, other than the fact that maybe there's a donor class that doesn't really seem to want those candidates to succeed. But there is a sweet spot in American politics, which would be left of center economically, you know, broadly supportive of government spending, all the Biden priorities that are very popular, you know, but also, you know, a little bit conservative on immigration and policing, but at the same time committed to democracy. And that's the missing spot in our politics. And, you know, in part, because of the way that the two parties have bundled the issues together, and because of the importance of the donor class, I think that sweet spot hasn't really emerged. I mean, that's kind of where Joe Manchin is, for example. And like, we need more of those candidates. But the problem is those candidates, the folks who hold those views tend to not be in the class of people who attend events like this and, you know, are part of these conversations. So you know, I think in a multi-party system you could see that faction emerge, but it's hard for that faction to organize right now. It's basically the you know, the conservative populist Democratic faction that was essential to the New Deal coalition. And, you know, which is different than the kind of professional class, suburban Acela Democratic class that, you know, everybody who thinks that they're a centrist, that Howard Schultz problem, thinks that what centrism means is socially liberal, fiscally conservative, when it really should mean the opposite if you want to be successful.
Thanks, Lee. We're coming up to the end of our time. I just wanted to pose one quick question then for each of you, which speaks to the last question that was raised. You know, we don't have that much time under a very plausible scenario where the 2024 election is not democratic. And the question is what we can do now to head that off. And I guess, is there any sort of sign that you're looking for that you're either on the right or the wrong track, for that matter? Is there anything that you would see that would be happening in the next year or two that would make you feel like you need to pursue a different path? Feel free to jump in, anyone, if you have an idea there.
I mean, I would say if suddenly the, you know, Republicans who are committed to the rule of law start getting more popular, or Trump starts getting less popular, you know, I would say that Kodiak's on the right path. I would say if Biden's popularity goes up among Republicans, and that there's more and more support for Joe Biden and Democratic candidates generally, even among Republicans, and Republicans start giving credit to the Biden administration and the Democrats for an economic recovery and the end of COVID, and Democrats start doing really well on the generic congressional ballot, I would say that Liam is on the right path. But if neither of those two things develop and things stay where they are, I think we have to really fully embrace the third party option, and with a multi-party option with a thoughtful 5-year plan about how, and with all apologies to communist Russia there, but I added thoughtful to how we get to a genuine multi-party democracy by 2026.
Thanks. Kodiak, do you have a quick concluding thought here?
Well, having been in the space for quite a while, I do continue to find the idea that we wouldn't have a free, fair, and secure election in 2024 absolutely gut-wrenching. But I think the things that we can all do are we can continue to pay attention to the state level efforts to restrict voting access. And that comes in a variety of shapes and forms. And some of them get a lot of headlines, but don't actually restrict the right to vote. So restricting access to voting is critically important, and making sure that you're watching that and you're paying attention, you're weighing in on that. We certainly are. I think backing the candidates who have held the line and who have done kind of the right thing, and backing them in the primaries. And also looking, I think, as Liam points out, there's some really vulnerable seats that are up and that could be challenged. And I think looking for those opportunities is also critically important, because I think it's not just about 2024. First comes 2022. That'll showcase kind of what the Republican playbook is going to be if there is a further consolidation of power and a move away from free and fair elections. I think we're seeing evidence of that. And so it's important to be paying attention to that now and taking these steps now.
Thank you, Kodiak. Liam, quick concluding thought?
Yeah, I think Lee, very thoughtful, saying, the 5-year plan. And I think the 1 year, what do we learn over the next year? I think that the path of never Trumpers forming a faction within the Democratic Party is highly complementary to both the other options. And I think that, the opportunity cost of doing anything that harms our chances of having a safe democracy it's a prohibitive opportunity cost. But that said, what the research shows is that an incumbent who faces a bruising primary challenge is more vulnerable in the general. So Republican primary challenges to anti-rule of law incumbents, that is helpful in a general. Conversely, if you're a challenger, winning a primary is actually helpful. So a moderate Republican turned Democrat who is challenged from the left in a Democratic primary is helped in the general, which you can think of rationally. Local TV in Colorado Springs, seeing somebody challenging Doug Lamborn beating a socialist in the primary, that's helpful to them in the general. And so this approach is highly complementary, I think, to what Kodiak is proposing and doing. And then I would say success, which again, it's tangible, specific, it's proven, it's a clear investment case. It will happen if we commit to doing it collectively. Is the best first step towards demonstrating Lee's vision in 5 years. I think if 18 months from now, Lee can say, look, we have one coherent faction on the far left and another coherent faction on the center to center left and center right. That is a huge step forward towards the democracy reforms that I think people need to change the rules of the game to have a better system in the long term. We need to win by the rules we have now in the meantime, though.
Thank you, Liam. Lee, quick concluding thought? If you can unmute.
Oh, unmute, yes. Well, yeah, this has been a terrific panel, and I think there's a lot that we all agree on here, which is the urgency of the threat and the need to continue to fight for our democracy. And I think we can do all three of these approaches, and see where things lead. I mean, the events are changing rapidly, and I think we should continue to have these conversations, and be be smart and be responsive to events and realities as they continue to evolve. So I'm really delighted to be a part of this conversation, this incredibly crucial and existential moment for our democracy.
Thank you, Lee. I completely agree. This is a critical question. I think it's one that each of you panelists has answered extremely well, and we've illuminated a lot of the dimensions of this question. And I thank all of the audience members who have turned in and asked questions and listened. And the video of this event will be available on the Niskanen Center website if you weren't able to see all of it, or if you want to share it with your friends in political circles. So on behalf of the Niskanen Center, thank you so much to all of our panelists and all of those in attendance today, and we'll see you later. Thank you.